We are talking about depression and antidepression. We're talking about pasta and antipasto. We are talking about how to deal with depression, and we're talking mostly about the dangers of prescription antidepressants. Why? Because in the news this morning was a heartbreaking story about a young girl, 19 years old, track star, goes to college, pushes herself too hard, gets anxious, gets depressed, goes home. The father sends her to a psychiatrist, puts her on medication, and she jumps off a building. Suicide. Nothing to laugh at. It's heartbreaking, the loss of a life. Why would a girl jump off a building after taking an antidepressant? We've talked about SSRIs. Let's go to Dr. Peter Breggin, who's been at this a lot longer than I have. Dr. Breggin, welcome back after so many years to the Savage Nation.
Yeah, glad to be with you again.
Remember years ago? We're talking over 10 years ago, aren't we?
Yeah, I would say roughly 10 years ago, and I've been talking about antidepressants causing violence and suicide since the second year after Prozac came out, about 1990, 91. So I've been
right.
That.
But you've gotten wide play since those years on my show, haven't you? Aren't you being listened to by Fox News and whatnot now?
Yes, more and more. And not only that, a lot of what I've been saying have been incorporated into the FDA labels for the drugs. So people are getting more and more alert. I'm just reading the textbook of psychiatry for a legal case I'm doing on a suicide from an antidepressant. And now the psychiatric textbook from the American Psychiatric Association says that physicians should warn about suicide in association with particularly starting the antidepressant drugs in adults, not just in children, but in adults. So,
but Dr. Breggin, when you first came on the Savage Nation years ago, we were most focused on the psychiatric pharmaceutical establishment pushing these drugs on children as young as 2 years of age. It's gotten worse in some ways, hasn't it?
Yes, it continues to grow worse and worse. The drug companies will market in any way they can. They will cover up adverse drug effects in any way they can. And I know this is a medical expert who goes into their records and looks at how they behave. And then in my field of psychiatry, psychiatrists are pretty unscrupulous about just going ahead with the latest drug and pushing it. And very, very few of us are willing to take a stand against the drugging of our children or the general drugging of people. It's a bad thing, Michael.
But you're a psychiatrist. You're not just an outsider looking in who's complaining about it. We're talking about a medical establishment that today treats ailments such as OCD, bipolar, bulimia, so-called social anxiety disorder, PMS, attention deficit disorder, with Ritalin, Adderall, Concerta, and the effects are quite hazardous: suicide, homicide. And what I'm trying to do is alert America to this all over again. I'm not the only one doing it, Dr. Breggin. So you say you're making headway, which is good, that the establishment is starting to incorporate such dangers on the labels. But what worries me the most is that for a kid to be declared to be disabled, the mother has to simply go to a shrink who says that the child has any of these illnesses, put them on one of these drugs, and suddenly their payments on SSI go way up. So there's a medical, welfare relationship here in a way, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a huge incentive for parents to put their kids on drugs. And I think that happens to a greater extent in the poor community. There have even been clinics in the inner cities that have catered to that concept. We'll put your son or daughters on drugs, and you can get increased aid from the government. But I think most parents are misled. Most parents simply don't realize that by putting their child on one of these stimulant drugs, they're giving the child something that's chemically almost identical to methamphetamine and cocaine, and that it's going to increase the potential for drug addiction when the kids grow up. We've been starting to track what happens to these people over the decades in the literature, and it's increasingly obvious that when you start a kid on drugs, you're inviting later incarceration in prisons, in hospitals, drug addiction. They're not good for the person. They're not good for the brain. And more evidence, too, Michael, that they actually cause shrinkage of the brain. That's gross damage to the brain over years of exposure. So you're sure...
Dr. Breggin, what amazes me is that the Senate, which should know better, instead of attacking the overprescription of these drugs and the imposition on these drugs on our children, instead had the nerve to attack caffeine. Some of the most liberal Democrat senators are on a warpath against caffeine in coffee, in sodas, and in other beverages, completely ignoring the damages and dangers of these powerful chemicals on our children. And I suspect it's because they may be in the pocket of the drug industry. Would I be wrong in making that assumption?
Well, first, you're absolutely right. I mean, the risks of caffeine are minuscule. They're there, but they're minuscule compared to the drugs we're giving our kids, which are, amphetamine-type drugs. So the risks are enormous.
Then why do senators like Blumenthal and others have a vendetta against soda, and they don't talk about Adderall in children 3 years old? There's only one explanation, and it's very ugly. And that's where the leadership is lacking, Dr. Breggin. Yeah, I'm saying it, you're saying it, others are saying it. But when you see a Democrat liberal leadership attacking a natural substance such as caffeine and looking the other way when you have such unnatural chemicals being foisted on our children, you have to ask which side the government is on.
Well, there's no question which side the government is on. The government has been promoting the drugging of children for decades now. The guys who work in the government, they want to, when they retire, they want to double dip and work for the drug companies. And the drug company psychiatric lobby, you're talking about the senators and how they'd be influenced, that lobby's just about the biggest. It's either number one or number two in Washington in terms of the money that they put in.
Can we find out if any of the American Pharmaceutical Association money has gone to Senator Dick Durbin, for example?
I would think you could research that. I'm not exactly sure how. That's very, very much on that political research, and I'll bet you could do that. I could try looking into it.
Well, because they're adamant. They're after caffeine, and they're saying nothing about Adderall. Yep. Dr. Breggin, let's get back to the subject at hand. Could you explain to the audience on the Savage Nation what SSRIs do and why people go into such severe depressions taking them and then might jump off a building? What actually happens? Is it that the body has a finite amount of serotonin, and then when the body can no longer pump it, so to speak, they fall into a black hole? Is that a simplistic analysis, or is that what happens?
It's not a bad metaphor. The theory behind these drugs was you had to pump up serotonin in the brain, and that would help with violence and suicide. It's a cockamamie theory. But what actually happens is the brain hates being disrupted. So when you take Celexa or Prozac or Paxil, it tries to pump up your serotonin in the brain says no. It shuts down the production of serotonin. It blocks all the effects it can of the drug. It even destroys its own receptors for serotonin in its effort to try not to be overstimulated. So when you...
Oh, my God. So the brain, in self-preservation mode, shuts down the receptors for serotonin? That's an amazing adaptation. So then what happens?
Well, the result is you've got this terribly unstable situation in a neurotransmitter system that goes to every single corner and crevice of your brain, goes down your spinal cord, exists in your gut, and exists in your blood. So you're disrupting this vast, complex network, and for some people, that leads to just loss of control. For other people, it leads to psychosis. For other people, to obsessive suicidality and violence. And we don't know, why one person exactly this way and one person exactly that way. But it's this massive disruption of a neurotransmitter system that's going throughout your brain that causes these acute disturbances. And, Michael, long-term what happens is the system wears out, and people start to get indifferent and apathetic. So, listen, in your audience, if you've been on these drugs for years, folks, ask your friend, am I as excited as I used to be about love, about my pets, about work, about my hobbies? Because without knowing it, your quality can be coming down on your life. But don't rush off the drugs either, because that's dangerous too, Michael. Coming off them is very dangerous.
So I've been talking about natural methods of controlling depression, and I don't want to go into them here. It's a separate show unto itself. But if a person is on these medications and they're starting to get alarmed by what they're hearing tonight on the Savage Nation, they shouldn't just stop taking them, correct?
That's right. Well, there's two key books. One book of mine is called Medication Madness. It'll show you what all the psych drugs can do to ruin your life. The most recent book is Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, and it talks about a person-centered, a patient-centered way of approaching withdrawal, which should be done cautiously. You should have a therapist involved if you can. You must have a family member or a friend involved, and you should come off at a really slow pace. And I describe that in Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal because some of
Well, I have to add, Dr. Breggin, as a person who worked in the field of nutrition for so many years, I would add to that therapy certainly mega doses of certain vitamins, and I don't think that you would argue with that.
Well, I think that's fine. I think exercise is probably, and moderate exercise is probably the single thing I'd recommend while you're going through any kind of a health stress, too.
I agree. I love that you said a moderate, because many people push themselves to the point of breaking with too much exercise.
Absolutely.
They think that by pushing themselves further, they're going to get away from depression. They may actually give themselves a complete nervous collapse.
I'm with you on that. I think you're doing a great service bringing this stuff up. One of the things we should add is the most recent violent mass murderer, the Naval Yard guy, had just started an antidepressant. And the press has been played down the Naval Yard shootings because immediately after they're coming out, it came out that he was recently put on an antidepressant by the VA, trazodone. And the new
even Adam Lanza was on psychiatric drugs. They wouldn't talk about it. They talked instead about guns and the NRA. Instead of Harvey Weinstein attacking the Second Amendment, he ought to attack the drug companies for pushing these drugs on the kids. Dr. Breggin, what is your website? Please give it out to the listeners of the Savage Nation.
It's Breggin.com, Breggin, Breggin.com.
And he's not begging, he's talking. Dr. Peter Breggin, thanks very much for being with us again.